Welcome to the second session of the Vive and Viveport Developer Day. For those of you who were here for this morning's session, you obviously saw a long range of titles and items and SDKs and platforms and systems that we'll be talking about for the rest of today. So this session will be a little bit different. This one is going to spend roughly the first 20 minutes, maybe 15, 20 minutes to talk about our digital platform and what Infinity means for the platform and why we also made the decision to go to this new subscription model. So if you're looking for a session with lots of videos and explosions, it will not be this one. It will have charts, numbers, and percentages. That'll be our main entertainment for this session. Then I'm hoping to have about a 30-minute panel discussion where I'm going to bring up on stage the teams from VR Chat, Photon, and Two Bear Studios to talk a little bit about their experiences being at the forefront and the early development steps in VR development and how it's different from PC or other platforms that you may have worked on in the past. And to hopefully provide some insight into things you can do to shorten your own development and development cycle. So we have Christoph Wegman, who's the CTO of Exit Games, Graham Gaylor, who is the CEO of VR Chat, and David Sapienza, who's the executive producer at Two Bears. And we'll talk more about that in the second half. And after that, we hope to have about a 10-minute Q&A. We might actually try to do that longer. There were questions in the first session, and we have some really great experts up here who would be more than happy to answer those questions. The mission of our team, as well as the general Vive and Viveport teams, is to try to grow the VR ecosystem. And it's a core mission for all of us, which means in some ways, we don't really have secrets or competitors. We do have a few, but we are essentially encouraging everyone to help build the next generation of entertainment and content and collaborate as much as humanly possible so that the entire ecosystem can grow and thrive. Ecosystems come and go, and I always find it amazing that we used to buy things physically in a store. I have two daughters, they're both under 10 years old. They have never got a computer game from a store in their lives. They assume that all computer games live inside this thing, this little tablet. You click on something, you play a different game. Clearly the store economy is a dying economy. There is some value in the physical and location-based participation. You can obviously turn these things in the future maybe into arcades or other kind of experience centers, and that's clearly a trend that's happening today. But the actual economy behind stores is obviously declining. It blows my mind that this chart looks back only 10 years. So 10 years ago, all game and entertainment sales, out of all game and entertainment sales, 80% was physical. So 80% of the time we would walk into stores, we'd purchase stuff, and by 2017 that had completely flipped. So now it's 80-20 the other way. And as I said, my 10-year-old daughters have never experienced that you actually had stores that sold games. Going forward, the expectation is that computer stores are a little bit like farming. There was a time in the 1800s when 75% of the population were farmers. Today it's about 2%. So physical sales or physical activities that relate to sales are probably going to go the way of the farmer from the 1800s. Of course, what this has led to is a bit of a problem for developers where basically everyone ended up building a digital store. And there is a pile of them. There's obviously Steam that was one of the very first ones, started well over 20 years ago at this point. And then every major publisher tried to come out with their version. You obviously came out with EA Origin, Uplay, of course bound to publishers and Epic. And in the midst of all that, especially as you move toward the end of this digital store cycle, you start having some companies or groups doing interesting things. Humble Bundle is probably the one to point out where you became a sort of supporter and a subscriber and you get these bundles of content really geared toward indie developers to get their content out and also to help discovery, to help an ecosystem that doesn't have the firepower of the Electronic Arts of the world. So, and as part of all this, Viveport was started about a year and a half or 2 years ago at this point, and about a year and a half ago added the first version of its subscription model. And as stores come and go, there really has been sort of 3 generations of these stores. The first generation and the first iteration of some of these stores was really just to mimic the physical goods sales. I've included Big Fish games here because if anyone here remembers back in 2002, you could buy from MSN Zone a $19 game of various puzzle games from Big Fish. And they then were being pretty innovative at it, and they tried various models going into social casinos. They went into various subscription models. It's been an interesting development, and they're still around today, but they still have some of the elements from the stores they built at this point almost 20 years ago. The second generation in store activity, of course, ended up being the various DLCs, the free-to-play games. There was a company based out of Irvine that brought free-to-play essentially to the US back in 2006 and 2007. It became kind of a big thing, but of course everyone had to build their own version of those stores. Steam was relatively late at adding free-to-play support, and they didn't add it until probably closer to 2008 or 2009. And then several people did various innovative things, like doing the user-generated content sales. There's the Steam Workshop, there's all these extensions to stores that suddenly recognize that you have developers and creators that actually need to sell their own content. But still, we're talking about content sold as individual items. So that led to kind of the 2.5G stores, which was very often innovations around, again, on the casual side, you had guys like Big Fish Games that created this membership. You got a credit per month, and for, I think it's $5.99 or some amount like that, you received a free game every month. And it became kind of a slot-based system. The most extreme version of that, I guess, is the latest Xbox Game Pass, which gives you effectively 100 slots, but they rotate in and out what titles are available for that particular period. But it's still a sort of a slot-based system, and it's often done that way because the developers or the publishers are afraid that if they don't have that, you would sort of risk cannibalization. And Viveport's first iteration of subscription is also a slot-based system. So for $8.99 a month, you get 5 slots, you can fill it with your 5 games, and next month you can have 5 more. And it's exactly like the original Netflix model. So we all seem to sort of move through the same phases. The third generation of stores is actually where it starts getting really interesting, because this is where we hope that everyone out here, all of you guys, will think in these terms and then turn it into new experiences we don't even have today. And Patreon clearly is not a game, but Patreon is a really interesting platform, because now you've moved to sort of the 2 categories of third-gen stores, one which is, you can have a subscription to an unlimited set of content. Obviously, that's very similar to Netflix or Hulu. But Patreon takes that a step further and essentially encourages you to not only view your content, but also subscribe to those who make interesting stuff. I found Patreon because I have found a comic who I thought was kind of great, and he did these, or cartoonist, and he made these great cartoons, so I supported him on Patreon, and that was my first introduction to it, realizing that some companies like VR Chat has creators that are on Patreon today, and you effectively have a peer-to-peer subscription economy on top of a content access subscription economy. So this is how we look at it internally as far as how stores are progressing, and I'll talk to you guys a little bit about what this VR market actually looks like. So first, a big shout out to our friends at Superdata Research. They're based out of New York. For those of you who don't know, Joost van Drunen, amazing little team. They're now part of Nielsen, and their job is trying to figure out this morass of info that sort of exists, but no one is really comfortable sharing. And they've done a pretty good job of finding ways to estimate and also contrast and compare these different sizes. So here's the best estimate that we can get on the market size of the VR home entertainment software space. So when it launched back in 2006, it was essentially around $180 million was the estimated market size for the entire market. And that's kind of an interesting number, because when you compare that to the entire game market, that's about 0.2% of the game market. With all the hype for VR leading up to 2016, it clearly was expected to start as a bigger splash. However, we've actually seen a tremendous amount of growth. So the hardware complexity, the hardware adoption requirements made VR, I think, a much tougher sell than the way it was anticipated when it first launched. But if you look out toward 2022, what you actually end up with is a very fast-growing ecosystem, especially as these new hardware innovations, new platform innovations, and software that makes the development cycle easier as those hit the market. So looking at the same data in a slightly different way, you can look up here is the total video game economy for home entertainment, so it doesn't include location-based. It starts at about $75 billion a year back in 2016. And then if you sort of follow these trends, even by the time you get to the end of 2018, you can see how the 180 million worth of market back in 16 for VR has actually grown by about 300% once you get to the end of 2018. And that's actually a pretty significant amount of growth for any market. And if you look across all 6 years, and this is of course an estimate, the estimated growth is about 30% for the game market in total, but the VR market is estimated to grow about 2,500% over that period of time. So the reason that's important is because today we still see a lot of game studios that are relatively small in the VR market, and it's still a very early market, whereas my boss used to say, it's early days. But what it leads to, though, is a set of pros and cons, right? So what are the issues with trying to build for this market, and where should you actually publish the things you work on? Well, clearly the biggest cons are that there's few established IPs. So if you're a game studio, it's not very likely that someone's going to come to you with a sequel or a third game in some category in VR. So there isn't that traditional sort of training track for studios who are used to getting these sequel kind of engagements in order to go live and train their staff really to be great at game development. There's also no guidelines. And what I mean by that is many people initially tried just grabbing PC games and making them into VR, and that turns out to be a pretty terrible experience. When we have the panel here later, we have some fun little anecdotes about just the things you don't think about when you run around in a PC game that you just take for granted, and in a VR game, it's all out the window, nothing works. And the final problem is that you have these early marketplaces like Viveport, like the Oculus Store, like in our case also the Wave ecosystem, which is essentially a set of stores across the Qualcomm devices that the team here was talking about this morning. And in those stores, we're still trying to figure out how do the users behave and how are they different than existing users. So those are the cons. Clearly, you should give you pause before you jump into this. The pros are this exact same thing. So there's few established IPs, so no one's going to go and sort of crush you with their modern warfare. You can go make stuff that's really, truly creative. There's no guidelines. So if you're the first person to figure out some mechanic, a really engaging system, or some kind of way of getting people engaged, the sky's the limit. You can essentially take over this market. And the early marketplaces is also a big pro because we are very likely to do what we've done this whole past year. We've had quarters where we've given 100% of the revenue to developers. We have obviously funded the Viveport Developer Awards to encourage people to get into the space. And as Rickard mentioned this morning, we're switching our rev share now from 70-30, the classic rev share, to an 80-20 rev share, as long as you put your title in the subscription side. So it's both pros and there's both cons, right? And the kind of innovation we've seen in the space, and this is obviously for those of you who have been in VR for a long time, that this was really innovative. When Beat Saber came out, it wasn't Guitar Hero, but it was clearly inspired by all of the sort of dance games like DDR and Guitar Hero. But the mechanic of it is once you've tried it, you suddenly go, oh, this is VR. This is a whole new way of interacting with the content that makes logical sense and takes advantage of the medium. And it was one of the few really innovative ways that people sort of broke the boundaries of the original PC games. The other one, of course, is VR chat. And we keep talking about VR chat because, and Graham will fill in more details on this, but in addition to being a really innovative platform to make content and share it with your friends and to socialize, it's also a great platform to actually view VR and just hang out and see what everyone else is doing. We'll talk more about it, but those innovation mechanics where you can cross the boundaries of different systems are very limited to brand new platforms. And good news, VR is a brand new platform. So as we mentioned several times here, we are launching what we call Viveport Infinity. It's the first infinite VR subscription, and unlike the slot-based systems, you get access to the entire catalog that has opted into it. And yes, there's going to be a few titles which are not part of the catalog. You can still purchase those. But of course, as we roll this out, we expect that people and developers will see the benefits of it. And we'll share some of those metrics here to help make the case that this is actually a model which we think and we believe in strongly, and we think is going to change the marketplace for all of you. One of the most interesting aspects of Infinity, and it may not have been clear, we've sort of mentioned it out there, is that when you buy a subscription as a user, no matter what device you have, you get access to the content across all the devices. And one thing we may or may not have explicitly said as a company is if you look at the various hints of what Cosmos is, you obviously had Qualcomm here talking about these tethered and connected devices. And if you followed the CS announcements, you could see that we were talking about it being connected to PC, but also there was an image of a phone that was stuck in sort of the Cosmos thing. And if you start thinking about that, it would be great, wouldn't it, if you had a subscription that could cross the boundaries between PC, Android, and all the different operating systems, especially if sometimes what you're subscribing to might be running on a PC in the cloud and maybe streamed down to you. So our entire backend and infrastructure around Viveport is basically transitioning into this expectation that it shouldn't really matter at the end what device you have. Now, as a developer, you may not write games for the Android side because your game is a high-performance game, but there are going to be some games that work well across the boundaries between operating systems and device types, which then leads to the next set of complexities, which are they 3DoF controllers, 6DoF controllers? How do these devices play together? And obviously, a lot of our effort is going into helping to bridge those systems. The next thing here I wanted to share, and this is where I will share numbers-ish. And what they are is actually our internal data for how the platform has performed. But we've left out the dollar amounts, but it's really good discussion about just where the trends are. So first of all, we have been about 18 months in now to this 5-slot subscription system. The graph looks like this for where we were about 18 months ago. And really, everything you see there in blue is what we call the Gen 1 store system. So these are the individual download purchases. When we started this, the very first little bar there is obviously when there was only individual download purchases. And then we launched the subscription service, and literally in month 1, it sort of became half the revenue. It slightly cannibalized some of the initial downloads, but then those actually recovered. Everything in yellow is the subscription revenues for this 5-slot system, which is live today. This system is going to remain live for only another 2 weeks, and then it gets replaced by the Infinity system. So I'm not really sharing tremendous secrets here because obviously the mechanics behind the system are going to change. What this leads to, if you follow this graph, is that the download sales, and it's a little bit hard to see this, but it actually grows over the period, and these are the blue items, and it grew about 19% over this 18 months. But the subscription revenue grew 590%. So because we had picked a slot-based system, we ran into some problems with this, and actually ended up having to do more for developers and put more money into sort of these rewards and the kind of give-backs and all that stuff. And I'll explain why that became a bit of an issue. What it means is that in total, the revenues right now are between 85 and 87% on the subscription side, and between 13 and 15% on the download and individual sales side. We expect to keep the systems alive, but they are clearly going to be about this ratio. So after the launch of Infinity, we assume that this will still be roughly the ratio that people want to interact with the content. You have these really engaged subscribers. We remind them they're a subscriber. We want them to come back. And we basically get about 85% of those subscribers to participate in the subscription system, or in Viveport users to be in the subscription system. The other thing we're going to do is give more money to developers. So we're adding an 80-20 rev share, but we're also, by switching from the slot-based system to the infinite system, we actually end up giving more money. And the reason for it is, the way the mechanic used to work was that for $8.99 a month, you got the 5 slots. If I, as a user, picked a game the developer got $1.25 for that month for that game. And if you think about it, if someone was subscribing to the game for 6 months or 10 months, it was a fair amount of revenue from someone who might not have picked your game and paid $9.99 or $19.99 for your game. The issue, though, turned out to be that not all users filled all slots. And when that happens, there wasn't really a clear method to then redistribute that revenue. So in the version 3 store that's coming out now, what we're really doing is paying you, the developer, the full amount of revenue, which in this case ends up being up to $10.40 a month. So that's the 80% rev share, and if I, as a user, pick just, let's say, one game, the developer gets $10 for that month for that user. If that user remains subscribed for 10 months, you might get $100 from that user because they really like your game. However, what we have seen is that users pick between 2 and 3 games that they really like and they engage with over a longer period of time, and then because it's free to try it, the expectation is they will try a lot of different titles, and over time they'll swap a game in or out. But what it means is that when you find a game, that game that really entices you, our expectation is that the developer will now actually see a much, much better return. It could far exceed the amount of money you would charge a single developer, or a single user, sorry. So one of the metrics which we track is just how engaged are you as a user. And the subscribers in the current system are our most engaged users. In fact, the subscribers are about 2.5 times more likely to actually buy things in our system. So the most likely buyers of that additional content are not the people who don't subscribe. It's actually the people who are subscribers. They also are the most likely to go buy new things, buy DLC, or add on to their account. They also are 2.8 times more likely to actually launch a title in a given month than non-subscribers. So what happens when you are a buyer of content, I'm sure this happened to you guys, I'm sure you have bought a game on Steam that you've never played. It has probably happened. It's happened to me quite a few times. As a developer, you sort of like that, well, you get that kind of to your favor. The drawback to it is you really get no engagement from that user, and you can't really build a service-based game around that experience if they never actually launched a darn thing. Sure, it might have a cool IP attached to it, might be a movie IP, and you get the breakage, but it doesn't actually build the long-term engagement. So our subscriber base that we're effectively curating is super engaged. They really want new things, and they also end up spending about 38% more money than those who buy individual digital downloads, which means that not only are they engaged, they are spending much more money just from their participation in the subscription system, and it cultivates these users and basically becomes this new user base for our platforms, which we then hope to present awesome content made by the community and made by all the developers who are here. So the question then is, why should you build software for this new thing called VR? And really our answer is, you want to take advantage of the new innovations in these platform business models because it is a new area. You want to launch new, innovative, and not yet big brands because there's space to do that. You're not going to be competing with the massive brands, at least not in the short term. And you can set the tone and the standard for how things should be built. And then our goal is to innovate the business model so that we can grow the ecosystem, and we really want to have the developers focus on creating the next set of great experiences. So that's kind of our mission statement, and with that, what I do want to do is just talk briefly about the 3 folks I'm going to bring up on stage here. And in addition to having a panel discussion, I also then will encourage everyone to have this conversation with us and ask your questions. So the first one is VR Chat. So VR Chat's core innovation, in my view, is that it's one of the first platforms that have really broken the VR to VR curious boundary. It's an interesting way to try to grow your VR experience. The second one is Photon. Christoph has been very into, I think for his whole career, trying to connect users and become this kind of breaking down the wall gardens and getting the different systems to talk to each other and play nicely with each other. And that fits perfectly with Viveport's mission. So as we announced this morning, we now have a close collaboration with Photon. We're going to be sponsoring some of our developers to use the Photon engine on the premium levels, and you can connect your developer account from Viveport straight into Photon, and over time we expect to add more and more benefits to that partnership. And then from Two Bears, we have the executive producer who will talk to us about the fact that Vive, Oculus, Windows Mixed Reality, and Wave are all different kinds of headsets. And as you build and design games for these things, it turns out to be quite difficult because you have to cross the boundaries of how the headsets behave, but it also turns out to be really critical in order to reach the largest audience possible. So with that, I do want to invite my friends here up on stage. And I'm chosen to call this panel the Pain, Opportunity, and the Road Ahead. So a big hand for our three guests. Woo! All right. So I did a really short intro, but I think it would be helpful is if each of you did a quick introduction for basically who you are and the company that you are working for or have founded. Awesome. Graham?
Hi, everyone. My name is Graham Gaylor. I'm the CEO and co-founder of VR Chat. VR Chat, we think of ourselves as a metaverse platform. Essentially, users can create and share social virtual worlds using the Unity game engine.
Hey guys, I'm Christoph Wegmann, CTO and founder of Exit Games. We built the cross-platform real-time connectivity service Photon, which is these days connecting 250 million players every month on our service. So from mobile games to PC games, console, and more VR connected and collaborative experiences.
Hey everyone, my name is David Sapienza. I'm the executive producer of Two Bears Studio. Two Bears is a first-party studio under the Vive Studios umbrella. So we're wholly owned by Vive. We started in January of 2016, and from the ground up, we were built to focus on VR content for Vive. And we've released Arcade Saga, which was our first game. It was actually 3 games into one. We had another puzzle game called Super Puzzle Galaxy we released last year, and now we are currently working on a project called Vive Sync, more focused on the enterprise market.
Awesome. So, and then for full disclosure, I believe both Two Bears as well as VR Chat are using Photon as its backend fully.
That's right.
So maybe we start with that. Maybe for Christoph, is what's your view of the VR market now that you see these connectivity components applied to VR? How do you see that from the backend side? Is VR a big market yet?
We have some success titles like VR Chat, for example, and a couple of other like Rec Room or Alt Space. So VR Chat is definitely pretty big, but it's still the exception. So we have a lot of VR studios and teams using us for games or enterprise services. It's growing, we believe in it, so we want to be early in that space, but as you said, it's early days and the budgets are not very high yet, so to pick middleware or services like Photon is very tempting for studios because they want to save budget, and in general we want to encourage studios to use services like us to focus on the content, to focus on the games, rather than wasting time building this on your own. And in the case of VR Chat, the guys have been very challenging, so to say, because if a game becomes a success very fast, you have to scale very fast, and the guys are using a lot of voice, and they were really testing our boundaries. So cramping a lot of users into rooms. Everybody was talking with each other, hacking going on, denial of service attacks on the servers. So it was quite a challenge. It's fun for us, and we really like to work with successful titles to grow them, and to enable these guys to really focus on the content. But to your question, so it's really early days. We believe VR, XR, AR, whatever, is going to be really big. And you need to be early to the party to play a role in the future there.
So it sounds like with your description of how VRChat uses Photon, their usage pattern is potentially very different than a standard PC game or mobile game with the use of voice or other kind of input systems. So maybe as a follow-up to that, and we'll come back to VRChat here in a second, but maybe David, how are VR development and development processes different than doing games for PC? Since you come from the PC side originally.
From the PC side or game console side, I think when you're approaching any sort of development, you can rely on those typical game tropes, right? You press A to open a button, you go and you focus on the moment-to-moment gameplay, these setups or interactions. That was the big focus on when it came to design. But VR, it made us realize like we can't really take advantage of those tropes, like opening up a door, for example. Do you reach out? Do we require them to reach out and actually grab the door handle? Do they need to turn it? Do they have to take a step back to open it, or use velocity to fling it forward? What if they have a gun in their hand? What do? Do they have to switch hands? You have to holster it? All those little moments, which I think as a VR player, that's what we like about. We're fully immersed. I can open the door, but do I have that backpack where I can just put everything in there? How do I access it? All those things that we take advantage of in the console world or PC world we couldn't really do. So it's really made us rethink how we approach design.
Are you saying that humans are lazy and we just like to move our finger across a tiny screen?
Perhaps.
And not like this?
Well, I think too, the user is different too across some of the ecosystem. Some put the headset on and they're like game on. They're ready. They're up for a physical activity and they're just geared up for it. And then others, they're still sitting at their desk. Maybe they put it on. They're just more of a kind of a casual user, and they don't really want to do it. If they drop their gun, it's like, do I really have to go down and pick it up? It's like, how far is that threshold of like bending over? How many times before you quit? So it's kind of understanding this ecosystem across all these platforms, and then the player dynamic.
So it sounds like it's actually more like designing for real-world sports than it is to actually design a game the way we think of it. Because, like you said, the WASD control scheme that we all know, you just run up to the door, you click an action button, something happens. Mm-hmm. But here, it's an interesting idea of like, do you turn the handle? How do you have to react, right?
Yeah.
How, do you feel that we have good answers to those things yet?
I think some people have done a great job in certain elements, but I think you even said earlier, we don't have a set of guidelines yet. So, and for me though, that's part of the fun. I like these. When you think you've got this design, and then you put it into practice, it's like, I didn't even think about that. And so, from a developer side, I actually really like that. Those are the part of the journey that I enjoy. But long answer, I would say no, we don't have those set of guidelines yet.
Awesome. So, which leads to then my friend Graham here, who it's interesting to me that VRChat actually is both VR and 2D/PC. How did that happen? How did you guys sort of do that?
Yeah, so back in the early days of VRChat, at its core, it's a creation platform for virtual worlds and avatars. So when you are a creator building something for VRChat, you are building it in Unity, and then you're testing it out in VRChat. And it was a little bit of a pain to have to put on the headset each time you wanted to test your avatar, your world.
So you were lazy?
We were lazy.
Okay, good.
So very early on, we enabled a non-VR version of VRChat basically to test out the things that you were building. And that kind of stuck with VRChat over the years. And then if you go look at kind of our growth numbers on Steam, you'll see that beginning of 2018, we had this explosive growth due to some memes going viral, some Twitch and YouTube streamers. But a lot of that growth was enabled because we had a desktop client, a non-VR client.
So then when you discover that, are you in the future going to try to go to other platforms? Is that your...
Yeah, as
making him reveal secrets. There may be secrets.
As mentioned, so 2018 we saw this explosive growth, super exciting. We were not quite ready from a number of different perspectives. Server infrastructure, we're working very closely with the guys over at Photon to make sure we could manage that. We had security issues come up, safety issues come up. So all of 2018 was really working on the core foundation of the platform. In 2019, a big goal of ours is to continue to grow our community And one of the big ways of doing that is looking at additional platforms, other VR platforms, but also other innovative ways of interacting with VR users from other platforms, whether it's from a web browser or your mobile phone or other interesting ideas. It doesn't necessarily need to be the full-fledged VR chat experience, but maybe just a window into the virtual world. VR chat is all about hanging out and socializing with your friends. So any interesting way we can connect users together is something that we're exploring.
Cool. So then, are there things today, and might be for Christoph, that you think platforms like Photon are not doing a good job of, like the things that still need to be innovated or expanded on to make life easier for developers?
If we can make things better, you mean? No. Well, so the longer something exists, the more you move up the stack. So Photon is around since a long time. So I founded the company back in 2003. So I feel like a dinosaur sometimes. But Photon exists since maybe 8 or 9 years. So we focus on real-time collaboration. And so we are slowly moving up the stack. So these transport layers are becoming a commodity. So you have Steam has its own networking. So Discord is coming out with a networking. Microsoft is launching networking. So all are, let's say, in their silos usually. Some are trying to have this cross-platform aspect, which we have at our core. But our latest products are more and more moving into becoming a game engine rather than a transport layer. So we have one product which is really, giving you like full networked physics and everything. So you can interact in VR like you do in real world. So I think this is the most interesting for us, is to make it more convenient on the one side, but not being, let's say, a bottleneck or a limitation for studios. So that's a challenge, is to find APIs which are on the one side very flexible, but not limiting.
So then your direction you're heading is to make it more high performance network systems, which also are cross-platform and really cross-game engine? Is that where you're heading with the Photon development?
Yeah, so we are trying to make the communication efficient, right? So we try to send less data. Funny enough, with 5G, all the operators are trying to say, oh, can you just use more data? We believe actually it's smarter to send less and be more efficient. Of course, latency, the lower the latency, the better. But there's always, let's say, so we are engineers, so we like to optimize stuff, make it faster, make it more efficient. So this is what's driving us.
And you're helping us stop developers from building their own stack, which is, by the way, for us, a huge important thing, because we don't want people to waste time on that.
Yeah, so they have to be, it's a risk, right? So for developers to pick a third-party solution, it's always, are they profitable enough? Are they staying around? Are they purchased? Do they go bankrupt? So it's always a bet. So, and we made that step towards, so we are mature enough to be able to be our own investor, right? So we don't need external investors anymore.
Yeah, no, and that's critical, because it's a hard choice. I spent 20 years in the game industry, and you had to choose. Do you build a platform or an engine or a backend system, or do you just get it from someone else? And there have been many of these platforms that have disappeared, like emergent game technologies, and various engines were bought up by bigger companies. But for us, I think it's exciting to see that we have starting to have the glue that VR developers can leverage to get stuff done and delivered. Maybe for David, I guess as we move forward with this whole infinity concept on the Viveport side, do you think that will help users actually find relevant content?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm super excited about the Infinity program. From, one of our first games, Arcade Saga, was part of the subscription right away, and so we saw the engagement. We saw how people kept it week or month over month, and that was good. But I think that, what I hear a lot from the content side is, from the gamers, like, oh, where's the AAA content? Where is that? And those take years to build, like a long time, and we're still trying to figure out things. But with Infinity, this idea where it's more of a subscription, you mentioned it up, I think, earlier about the, episodic content. So for whether Xbox Live Arcade or some other, even PC platforms, episodic ideas like, oh yeah, you can make a great vertical slice and then keep going. But you always see that high adoption, and then next release is a little bit less, and then a little bit less, and then we've never really seen an episodic content take off. But if you think of it like like the Netflix model, you're more likely to continue on. So, and that's what you want as a software developers, people to stay engaged with your content. So it allows them that I don't have to risk, I have to buy this other episode or buy this other. It's not a constant, purchase paywall every time. So
You don't have to buy sort of the sequence of DLCs for everything you want to see next.
you get to actually just keep it. So I think it's a really smart thing.
Yeah, no, and I think from our end, obviously, we have thought really hard about how do we help the developer community get more revenues for the things they do, but also engage people, right?
Yeah.
We don't really want people to make a VR game that just sits in the closet. We would like you to make something that makes people come back. And that's how we structure this entire system. I think from my side, actually, if you have questions, we are at about 10 minutes left in the session. So if you have questions for either myself or any one of the fine gentlemen up here, we're happy to take those. And then before we take the questions, I just want to point out that the entire afternoon is going to be 5 hours worth of sessions with our engineering and software teams. So for those of you who are building the various components of VR, definitely come check those out. Check out the hand tracking systems, check out all the different SDKs, the Viveport SDKs, all the different ways you can interact with people across these platforms. So with that, if you guys have questions, there's a microphone over there, and we're happy to answer it. And the fine gentleman here on my side will hopefully answer some of the questions if they're not too difficult. We have no brave people. And if we don't, then I will continue the questioning up here. Go for it. State your name and who do you work for?
My name is Nick Kukis, and I am currently a student at Cogswell Polytechnical College.
Welcome.
And I wanted to ask, so you're talking earlier about the growth of the VR market. How are you sure that it's not going to plateau, especially given the current restrictions on the mechanical side of things and the spatial side of things?
So that's more of a market question. I think the answer to that is there has been a lot of new types of devices coming out. Obviously, the Oculus Go is a good example, the Vive Focus, which are catering to a different way of engaging with the content. None of us can be sure, but when we have seen these big blips like Beat Saber or VR Chat, you know that there is mechanics there which have the potential to be really big. I like to think of the VR market now as like the Apple Newton, right? The Apple Newton was a decade ahead of its time, and eventually everyone got an iPad. But the innovation around it really started way back, and then sort of became mass market at a later technical stage. Okay. But can we be sure? No, but the market we've seen the last 3 years has accelerating growth on the software and content side.
Okay, thank you.
And just to add a little bit to that, if you go into VR Chat today and talk with any of our non-VR users, and ask them like, hey, like, why don't you have VR? The answer is it's too expensive and they want it. So at least from our perspective, we certainly feel that as the hardware gets cheaper and in higher quality, then the market's going to continue to grow and users are going to buy it.
Okay, thank you.
Hi there, I'm a CA from Nordic Forest Games. We make health VR games. So could you elaborate a little bit more regarding the numbers that you showed for revenues for subscription and your thoughts about in-app purchases and subscription models? Like how do developers think about these things?
David, do you want to jump into that, or I'll happy to answer it?
Well, I think, as far as the numbers, I think, actually, my next session, actually talk about some of how Viveport SDK enables in-app purchases. But it's the people who are subscribed, they're more engaged because they're more invested. They already have their investment, so they try to make more use of their content. And Bjorn's got the numbers.
Yeah. No, I think we're not encouraged. If you have a game that's in the premium subscription, we don't necessarily encourage you to also sell in-app items, but you could, from a technical side, you can actually do it. Ideally, if you're in the subscription side, we want you to be more thinking of it as sort of a long-term engagement. But we are exploring all kinds of ways to expand that. VR Chat is thinking of ways to let the users act as their own subscribers to each other. We have systems around to help you decide. But our experience is if you want to be an in-app purchase or free-to-play game, you really should just be a free-to-play game that sells items. The drawback to that mechanic is that if you don't have a super engaging mechanic, it's difficult to get you to come back. So a subscription mechanic often seems to engage people more in an early stage market because they get reminded like, oh, I still have this running, I should go check it out. So there's kind of two different mechanics. You could mix them. We haven't seen anyone who have successfully mixed the two yet. Either it's a free game with items or it's a subscribed game with sort of more of a continuous experience and long-term engagement. And it's kind of two different mechanics. But you could experiment and do both.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Heather from Emerald Activities. I'm working on Mutato Match and Shaver. I have a similar related question. What about small games that are very unlikely to bring back people over and over and over again?
Well, it's interesting to say that. There are some experiences that you even get with the Vive, like most here have probably tried the Blue if you're in VR. And it turns out that when people come across cool games or things which are still single player, people tend to come back to them to show their friends and their family. So something like the Blue has an amazing amount of engagement over, we're talking years, which is a little surprising actually. And if you look at the engagement track, it's like they are a good example of something which is an easy to grasp experience or an easy story that often then gets shared with your families and friends. And if you make that a premium subscription experience, people will generally come back and still play them. But of course, it depends entirely on the game. If you make something that's a 4-minute experience and you can never replay it, probably not a good model for subscription. But just make another one. You know, next month, make a second game and a third game.
Thanks.
Steve Grubbs, Victory VR. We focus on educational content. And so a couple of questions, if I could. One, Springboard is coming out with an education-focused subscription platform. Is there any thought to separate out education content on the Vive platform that could be focused to schools? Because we get that question a lot. The second question that we get that's relevant to VR chat is, so we have in our company, we have a Mandarin teacher and also an English teacher who teaches to Mandarin students. We have had a question a number of times from teachers whether there was a way to essentially do a VR chat, create a classroom, teach Mandarin, but we don't know what the subscription model or the revenue model would be for something like that. So those are the two things that we're exploring in both social, VR, and subscription-based.
So let's do the first question, which is, so we have something called Viveport Arcade, which is also a arcade like Springboard, and we have approached the idea of looking at libraries and other educational components. We haven't gone as far down the road. What we do have is a partnership with a company, it's called Vive EDU, that's based out of China. Vive EDU is actually a classroom. It is a virtual classroom that uses a whole set of focuses, and then basically you engage together. And then as a third thing, David here, while they are technically a game studio, have transitioned now to also make enterprise software, specifically collaboration software. And David can share a little more about how that works. It's not yet focused on education, but it's something where even internally we're looking at, can we take components that work well in, let's say, enterprises and turn that into an educational collaboration thing? So the Sync app is specifically...
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of it, whether it's a social, we're going to go have a multiplayer game or session, or whether we're here to talk about business or education, a lot of the core fundamentals are the same. It's networking, getting people in the same room, talking, showing avatars, getting facial expressions, all those, that body language, all that feedback is all the same. So, like for my studio at least, we're focused on building that kind of core architecture, that that horizontal, and then we'll figure out which verticals we want to tackle with that later, or at least offering that up. So we're still in the development of that and figuring it out, and actually we'll be demoing it in GDC on Wednesday at our booth, so you can check it out, and then we could actually have more deeper discussion about it if you want.
Yeah, and for us, again, we're really excited to see what even guys like Springboard or others are exploring in the market, because One thing we have learned from education, and we don't have the stats here, is that if you learn something in VR, you retain it more. So compared to learning from a live teacher in a classroom, if you're in VR, your ability to remember is much, much higher, partly because you're not distracted by anything else. You don't have Facebook in front of you. There's not all this other stuff going on. You're truly 100% immersed. So there's a huge opportunity there. And again, I think there has been a lack of mechanics that have been invented to make that useful and simple and easy. But it's coming, and obviously some of the new devices will help, and then a lot of the research that's been done for enterprises, training, and for all these other components will make it easier over time. And I think VR chat education, is that what you guys are going to do next?
Certainly education is one of the verticals that we're interested in. Today, our goal is to essentially be the platform, enable the networking, the social components. Today, a lot of what we're seeing is based around gaming or just social hangouts, but we have seen a few groups do educational experiences. With VR Chat today, what you've, suggested is certainly possible. Having a world set up, have a teacher, teaching another language, and then have students in that room present with the teacher, learning, the way that VR Chat does worlds and instances of the world. You can have kind of private experiences, so to not have the public coming in. If that's something that you guys are really interested in, definitely reach out to us over email. We'd love to work with folks that are interested in that.
Of course, they've done a very educational thing, is when they had a concert with deadmau5 as the DJ. That was very educational. So I think, but those technologies are, of course, similar to what you would use in an educational or a library setting, for sure. So anyone else with questions? Otherwise, I think we're doing excellent on time. So what I will do is I'm going to end with just a couple of prediction questions here to our panel, unless anyone else is ready for that final stump the panel question. So for each one of you guys, where do you think VR heads next? And it can also even go outside VR if you expect it to sort of, some change that's coming down the road. So David, what do you think is next for VR?
What's next? I think, as the devices get smaller and more easier to use, I think, I guess from my studio, my perspective, we started off on games. That was my background, the entertainment side, subscription, all those things. It's all entertainment platform. But from a Vive Studios and all the input we get mostly from companies saying that they want VR, would you got the VR curious? It's
trademark
people
now,
that
by the
are
way.
outside of entertainment. So I think as we all start to mature as an industry, the potential of growing to all those different sectors is where I see it really kind of expanding. Not even just, the entertainment will always be there, but many more verticals outside of just gaming.
Christoph, any thoughts on what do you think is going to happen to this thing called VR now that you've been in the industry for 15 years and helped all the other platforms?
Yeah, so I think the getting rid of the wires and having like this easy headset lying there and you put it on and you have the experience, that's the breakthrough in the end. So my wife kills me if I've set up my wife in
Yes.
the house. So, and then every year on Christmas, when the family gathers, I bring some gadgets home. So this year it was Magic Leap, but the year before it was VR. And VR was much more impressive for my family, at least. And I think I can feel that it will get there. It's just a matter of availability. And VR is simply not available to most people. That's the problem.
So growth will take care of that, and new devices will fix the boundary where people can't get into it. Graham, since you're living this every day in VR.
Yeah. So for us, just the fact that headsets are becoming cheaper, higher quality, I think is the most exciting, being accessible to everybody. I've bought headsets for a few of my family, and it sits kind of in rooms unused, but as soon as we have a device that I can hand, one of my friends, and it's like, hey, here's a gift for you, and it just kind of works out of the box, that's going to be a really magical moment. Moving forward for VR chat, VR is just one window into kind of the social experience. I talked about looking at 2D experiences, mobile web, but AR is also very interesting. People oftentimes talk about, AR versus VR, but they are just, again, windows, different windows into various experiences. So, moving forward, light, cheap, high quality VR and AR headsets, I think, are what I'm excited about.
Cool. So then, of course, as the Viveport person, I have to give the plug to, we're hoping that all those technical innovations happen, but then with the innovations around the business models and ease of accessibility once you get your headset, we're hoping that people will continue to engage with the content and continue to remember that they don't have a VR headset just in the closet, but actually take it out and use it. So from our side, I think it's been an amazing ride the last 3 years as we've gone through this and learned so much. And our hope is that some of you guys out in the room today will figure out what that next awesome interaction is, the next use case like education, libraries, whatever the components are, and that we can effectively follow after and help optimize what those different experiences are. So that's clearly from the Viveport side. If you guys have any other questions, you can catch our panelists afterwards. And right now we have a lunch break. I know everyone's ready for some lunch. And then I believe it's at 1:20. I think is the start time of the next session. And the 1:20 session is going to be focused on the Viveport SDK. And then from there on, it's going to be all these different integration systems. So if you are a developer or if you have an interest in those technologies, definitely come back for that session. Again, huge thanks and a huge thanks to our panelists. Thank you.